So we were responsible for two types of radar. What we referred to as people finders radar, which was an AN PPS-6. It was a radar, small radar, about a foot square, operated on a 5-foot tripod. You had headphones on, so it used the Doppler effect, and it would go back and forth, and you had a range window that you could crank out and crank back in as you're going. And you tried to pick up something different. And after a while, you could tell somebody walking, you could hear their hands moving and so forth. So that was one type. And then the other type was counter mortar radar. So this is radar that operated in conjunction with a mortar team that it could do two things. So it would register or get a return on a mortar round parabolic arch. And from that, if you would be coordinated to a military map, you could tell either the origin or the destination of where the round was going to hit. And so, of course, that we wanted the origin, we changed the radar to those, and then we'd send counter mortar radar weapons to those.
So you're not operating the radar, but you're repairing them.
That's correct.
So does that mean then, and you arrive in Vietnam in '69, are you then moving from site to site throughout I-Corps, just sort of maintaining these different radar sites, or
So
what?
I thought that's what I was going to be doing, but I was assigned to the 2nd Battalion, 26th Marines, so that's all I was responsible for. So again, I was made a member of what we called the tech shop. So in that tech shop, we worked on field phones, we worked on backpack radios and Jeep radios. We also had radios that our forward air observers would use to communicate with planes and helicopters. So that's what we were responsible for. We had SID device, seismic intrusion devices. So those would be, you could put them out in front of a perimeter at night, and somebody'd have to wear a headphone microphone inside their helmet. And these would make a noise if somebody was coming in. I don't know how much were used of these. We were responsible for repairing them.
So your MOS is ground radar repair technician, but it sounds like you're repairing and maintaining much more than
Right.
radar equipment.
So as soon as I got to the tech shop, I learned radio repair very quickly, because that's primarily what we had to deal with was the AN/PRC 25 backpack radios that the companies took out in the bush. The companies would recover every so long. They'd spend maybe a couple of days, a week, maybe as long as a month out in the bush. Then they'd come back to the rear where I was. They would get new utility uniforms, because everything they wore had rotted off of them. All their material would be rehab. So any radios that they had a problems with, they drop them off. So whenever a company would come in, we'd have operators coming by, dropping radios off, saying this such and such doesn't work. We ended up with a whole bunch of radios. So we would get them, we would do first echelon repair. So very shortly, even though I had not gone through any radio training in the least, very quickly, in a week or so, I picked up just about everything that could go wrong with a radio.
So my impression, you referred to yourself as being in the rear, but when I think of the rear, I think of guys, the rear echelon. I think of guys who are, working on the base deep in one of the bases in Da Nang or Cam Ranh Bay or something. So you've got them, and then you've got the guys out in the bush that you talked about. I'm kind of seeing you as in
So
between.
you had the the rear echelon guys, the guys that operated in Da Nang somewhere,
Yeah.
or other, like a division level or other level like that. So we were at the regimental level. So we were the headquarters. I was always with the headquarters platoon for the regiment. That was in an LZ typically. So I spent the whole time at LZ Rock Crusher with 26th Marines. That's where the regimental headquarters was. That's where H&S was, Headquarters and Service Company, which I was a part of, and the communications platoon, which I was a part of also. So
Sure.
we were in LZ. I call that kind of an interim level. It wasn't in a city level,
Yeah.
but it was out there in the middle of nowhere. I think the second day we were at the Rock Crusher, we'd come back in off the New Orleans. We were just setting up, getting acquainted with our new area. And I got up early one morning, woke up, went out to the urinal. So if you're familiar with that, basically a urinal back for Vietnam in a rear area like we were was a 55-gallon drum that had a screen over it that was buried in the earth.
Yeah.
So I'm standing at the urinal doing my thing, and all of a sudden I heard like a freight train is coming. I went, what is that? And I look up to where the noise was, and it was a rocket. And I could see it. It was about 5 feet long. It was about 10 feet over my head. It went over my head, and it struck. I landed about probably 50 yards from me and blew up. So I said, "Oh my God, we're getting incoming." So I ran back, incoming, incoming. Everybody said, okay, you know. It turns out all it was a short round. So instead of going and hitting the air base at Da Nang, which was a couple of miles away, it just something was wrong with it. It was a short round. It happened to land close to where I was and blew up. When I was with 26 Marines at LZ Rock Crusher, usually once a week I'd have Sergeant of the Guard. So with that, my job was to hang out in the guard in the communication shack with the officer of the day, and then I'd have to go out and check the posts. So we still had fighting holes. Now LZ Rock Crusher was roughly horseshoe shaped, and up the top for everything that was facing west or around, we had holes up in the top there, and each company, the company was assigned to so many holes, and then H&S company would sign so many holes, etc. So they had to man those holes every night. So as sergeant of the guard, my job was to go to the holes and make sure the guys were awake, you know, making sure, asking if they'd heard anything, etc.
Right.
So at the Rock Crusher, uh, never really had any problem. We never got any incoming, like we did down at LZ Ross. Just that one short round. We never got mortared that I recall after that. Um, so it was basically, we went through the motions, let's say, of what you'd have to do if you were facing a bunch of unfriendlies, but we didn't have a problem. Now, some of our companies out there, they were still taking casualties out in North Da Nang. Wasn't much going on as far as firefights, mostly dealing with snipers. The big thing in Vietnam, the thing that caused the most injuries by far were booby traps. And they would booby trap anything.
How was your time later in the war when you go to the 7th Marines, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines? How is that different from the first part of your tour?
So it was like night and day. I believe it probably was 50 miles south of Da Nang in the Quai Son Valley to LZ Ross. and that was where the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines was headquartered. This was in the by God boonies. This was way out there. Nothing like LZ Rockrusher where I'd been, where I was just 4 or 5 miles away from the airbase. So didn't know what to expect when so this guy, they send somebody up from H&S Com up to get me. I was at the company, or I guess the regimental area then, and took me down and to the com officer, and I was introduced to him, and he said, "You're going to be my tech manager." He said, "I've looked at your record, and I've got good reports on what you did when you were with 26 Marines. You got them through an IG inspection, and they passed." So he said, "I need your help because this tech shop is in bad shape." So he said, "I need your help to get it on because they got another IG schedule at such and such a date. So I want you to do everything you can to get the shop ship shape, get all the records and all that kind of stuff." So I started working on the shop during the day, and then they said, "You're a sergeant, you're a Marine." Oh, now I got into that whole thing. Every Marine is a rifleman. So when I got down to LZ Ross, my role as a NCO took on a whole different meaning as far as my military duties. So basically, I had a job. My daily job was the tech chief, trying to get the shop put together, get it in a semblance of shape, initiate some of the things that I'd done in 26 Marines to help. My tech shop duties were during the day. My military duties were mostly at night. So I had sergeant of the guard, became most important there because we had wire, we had fighting holes again, we had layers of concertina wire, and the foxholes, the fighting holes. It was very imperative that they stay awake in these holes because the battalion that had been there previous to us, to 2nd Battalion going in, I think it was 1st Battalion, I don't remember for sure, they kind of got reversed out in disgrace because one of their holes had gone to sleep. Sappers had came in, then they came in through the wire with satchel charges. They got in, they killed all the Marines that were in that hole that were asleep. They went through the area throwing satchel charges, and a lot of Marines were killed, and a lot more were wounded. That happened just a couple of weeks or a month before the 2nd Battalion was put in there. I joined them not too long after that. So it was real important then. My duties were critical that I'd go out and check these people in the holes. So that was sergeant of the guard. I also had once a month, I was in charge of the road sweep. So our resupply base was LZ Baldy, which was also south of Da Nang, but just not as far south. It was off of Highway 1. Highway 1 ran right along the coast of Vietnam. That was where we got our resupplies from, for the most part. So once a day, a convoy would come through from LZ Baldy to LZ Ross. Before they came through, the road sweep would launch from LZ Ross, where we were, and also from LZ Baldy. I think it was probably, don't quote me on this, I want to say it was like 15 or 16 miles in between. So we were responsible for halfway, and they were responsible for halfway.
Mm.
It would take about a couple of hours. We had engineers with us with metal detectors. We had security. We had flankers out going along the road, and also had a radio man with me with a backpack, quick 25. So we'd go out, checking the road. Every time the metal detector would find something, they'd stop, we'd back away, set up security, they'd dig it up. Most of the time it was nothing.
Hmm.
We never found a mine, never, in all the times that I went through there. The reason being is I don't know back in those days what the quality or uh, the 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 mine detectors, but the NVA and the VC would make all the mines out of wood, make them out of a box. So there was no metallic content except the detonator. The detonator was real small compared to the rest of it. So we never uncovered any mines.
Yeah.
So we go out there.
Was LZ Ross ever hit while you were there?
Yes. So constantly while I was there, we got incoming a couple of times a week, mortars or in rockets. So I got the point where, and that's another thing, since we were there, uh, every building that was on the base, even though they were all sandbagged, they all were the coordinates. They had the coordinates for every building. So we weren't allowed to sleep in the buildings. So we slept in a hole the whole time I was there.
The VC had the coordinates for all the buildings?
Yep. So
Now, I'm assuming that's because folks who,
work.
locals who worked on the base gave the VC the information?
Yep. Yep. So we had civilians that were like, we had after a while, we had a civilian barber. We had civilian laundry. So they'd come in and they'd pick up your laundry and they'd uh, pick up, then they do the barber. And I think they had them working in other stuff. They're doing other stuff too. They come in, you better believe that they would, somebody footstep in this direction, that's where the building such and such is. So they had it all laid out. So because of that, we couldn't be in the buildings. And again, like I say, 2 or 3 times a week, we'd get 15 or 20 mortar rounds come in.
Wow.
And then a couple of times we had, uh, like when they attacked Quai Son, which was a, uh, a regional city for the Vietnamese, and now also Arvin base was there. They attacked that. They also, at that night, we got rockets and mortars. We got, who knows, I don't know how many, 100 or more mortars came in that night, plus rockets, trying to keep our heads down so it wouldn't go to the age of the Arvins who were defending the regional town there, Quai Son, which was about probably 600 or 700 meters away from us.
Hmm.
Or no, I'm sorry, probably 6 or 7 K from us.
Even though there was the sense that these Vietnamese working on the base were providing information to the Viet Cong, did the Vietnamese continue to work on the base even
Yeah.
though?
So unless
Yeah.
something happened where intelligence found out that such and such is, even though his name is there and he has a identification card, we found out that he is a member of VN, uh, VC cell such and such, then he'd be carted off. That was rare.
Did you have much interaction with Vietnamese civilians when you're on the bases?
When I got a haircut and when I'd give the mama son my laundry, when she'd come around and pick it up.
Okay. Did you feel like in your personal interactions that you could trust them?
No, because everybody knew that uh, that you could trust him when you could see him and that, but you couldn't trust him at night.
Wow.
Everybody kind of knew that.
And you mentioned the Arvin. Did you have any personal interaction with the Arvin forces?
So again, when I had the road sweep, we went by the Arvin base. We went by Quai Son, and then we went by the Arvin base. So we had to be careful when we went by the Arvin base because a couple of times they would snipe at the Marines going through just for fun.
The Arvins would?
Yes.
So what was your, so I think you've just kind of answered this question, but what was your perception of the ARVN forces?
Uh, the force, if you know the colors of the Vietnamese flag, right?
Yeah.
It was red with a stripe on it. So it's yellow stripe. So we used to say they fought under the yellow flag with the small red stripe on it. We didn't care much for them. We didn't care much for them as a fighting force.
Did that have much of an impact on you at the time? I mean, you're not out in the bush with those Marines, but you know that there are American Marines out in the bush. You know that they're getting into firefights. You know that they're getting ambushed, that they're hitting traps and mines, etc. And then you're seeing these ARVN forces. Um, did that, did that thought go through your mind like, well, we're fighting for their country, but are they?
So very quickly, my attitude, I was not fighting for Vietnam. I was fighting for my fellow Marines to do my best to keep their comm equipment up so they could be in it more protected because they could call in incoming or medevacs, stuff of that nature. So very, very quickly, even before I got to 7th Marines, I kind of felt my job was to help defend my fellow Marines, and Vietnam, I didn't care too much. It wasn't high on my list. I didn't feel like they were doing enough for their country. And where I'm saying they, talking about the ARVN.
You mentioned the South Koreans earlier, South Korean convoy. Did you have any interaction with them at all?
I knew of them mostly by after seeing them there, seeing them a couple of times just in the area, and then mostly by word of mouth that you didn't mess with ROK Marines, the
With the Republic
Vietnamese.
of Korea, yeah, with the Republic of Korea Marines, yeah.
They, the VC and the NVA didn't want to have anything to do with the ROK Marines. They didn't want anything to do with pretty much with the American Marines, and but they still didn't, because the ROK Marines, for instance, if they were traversing and they went through a ville and they got sniped at, which was very common. If you went through a ville, you get sniped at. Uh, if they got a sniper round fired at them, they would go in. They would kill everything in that ville, every person, every dog, and then light the ville on fire. That's how they handle it. So
Yeah, they weren't operating with the same rules.
no, they had no. The rules of engagement were, do 25 times as much to them as they do to you.
I want to go back. When you arrived in Vietnam, did you get into Vietnam on a commercial flight or a C-130 from Okinawa?
Commercial flight.
Commercial flight.
Yeah.
Um, do you have any recollections of that flight in, or it's a series of flights, I know, but
Yeah.
you're on that last flight heading into Da Nang, do you have any recollections of that flight?
So we landed in Da Nang. First off, I remember uh, it's funny doing landing in Vietnam in a commercial airliner because they did almost a combat descent and a combat takeoff, which is funny on a commercial plane. But anyway, so we came in kind of at a steep angle and we circled the Da Nang airport, I think once before we got set up to come in. I remember seeing all the green jungle and the hills and mountains. I said, wow, look at that. And then the white sand beaches and so forth. And I said, pretty place. That was my first landing there. Then we landed and they opened the door. And of course, the heat and the humidity came in. That wasn't a big thing to me because I'm from Houston.
Hmm.
I was used to the heat and humidity.
Yeah.
But the thing that I remember was the smell. And that smell finally left me. And I say finally probably about 5, 7 years ago. But
What do you
up
mean
until
by-
then,
Huh?
I still remembered that smell.
Mm,
And it was from Nuck Nom.
mm,
Nuck Nom, it's a fish sauce that they make with rotten fish heads, and they put some other stuff with it. And that's what Vietnam smelled like to me. That and cooking fires. When you're a leader and you take men out in combat, the uh, the mental load that puts on you, where you're responsible for their lives and you're making decisions under those conditions. Um, I found that difficult to relate to. We had what the way it was phrased back then is not really good nowadays to say this, but it was gooks in the wire. So the the so the sergeant of the guard, we hear somebody on a field phone or a radio would say, "Hey, we got gooks in the wire," and we'd hear about that time. We'd hear shots where they'd open fire, explosions where they threw frags, fragmentation grenades, etc.
yeah.
So sapper comes in. He comes in and tries to listen to see if he can find a hole that's gone to sleep. And if so, he'll come all the way through. He'll kill them, motion the rest of them in. That's how they come in. The Como Hill at LZ Ross, that was up on the high. That's where we were. We were up there. So we had a fighting hole, a big hole that was probably, let's say, a meter or two in diameter. It was about 5 feet deep. So that was our assigned fighting hole. So incoming, whatever incoming we had, our job was to get to that fighting hole with your rifle and black jacket and helmet and ammo and so forth. But so I could be sound asleep. I got to where I would hear the mortar round take off, and I would hear it through the air. I'd hear that while I was sleeping. Without even waking up, I'd wake up in the fighting hole with my helmet and all the stuff. That's just how you were trained and how you would be. And it didn't take long for that to be.
Wow.
So,
Yeah.
so I was, so I was up in the commo bumper, except if I had sergeant of the guard. If I had sergeant of the guard, then our sector had its own kind of headquarters hole, and so that's where I would be. So that would be close to the wire. So the Marines on the whole fighting holes would be in front of me. So then if we had incoming, then we could from engage in there, keeping the fire above the heads of the fighting hole. We could fire out into the wire at that point. We've come back to a hole that was kind of behind the wire. So the fighting holes right at the wire were in front of me by about not far, 10 or 15 meters. So I was there. So and I was responsible for probably 8 or 10 fighting holes. So one particular night, I had sergeant of the guard, so I was at that hole. So there were 2 other sergeants that were with me, and we split the night up into shifts. So we were on for 2 hours, I think it's 2 or 3 hours. So you'd be on duty, then you come back, and you kind of crash there, except if something happened. So I had already had my shift, let's say, and I was kind of crapped out on the outside of the hole on the ground. Um, I was sleeping on my rubber bitch. Have you heard that term before? That was our air mattress. We call them rubber bitch.
I haven't
So,
heard that phrase. No, I've heard others, but I haven't heard that one.
so I'm asleep in there, and all of a sudden, all hell breaks loose. And so I wake up, and I'm in the bottom of this hole on my head, and all this hell's going loose. And I said, what's going on?" And they said, "I don't know, man. We're getting bad." And I mean, mortars are dropping, rockets are going, and it turns out that the NVA, the BC, or I'd say NVA mostly, because by then I learned later there weren't any BC left. It was all NVA at this point, but because we killed all the BC, so
Yeah.
it was just NVA that was left. They were hitting Quezon, which was the regional government town around the base, and they were trying to keep our heads down so we wouldn't go out there and help them support. So, um, I mean, all hell's breaking loose. So we had goofs in the wire. We're firing at them. They're firing at us, and that went on for about an hour. And then we turned out later, so they had formed a react platoon, gotten together, and the battalion's second in command took the react platoon down the road to the Ville, and they had a bad time down there. So I had a guy.
They took fire from the village.
Absolutely, they had people, so they had to fight their way into the village. They set up a security perimeter, and then they had to guard medevac choppers coming in to get the wounded out. So they had a firefight going on for a couple hours down there. Killed a bunch of NVA, and I saw them the next day. And I took my Jeep and trailer the next day. I headed up to Da Nang to go to First FSR, and whenever a VC was killed or NVA was killed, the ARVN would drag them to the road. In this case, they took them all and they dragged them into a pile and they stacked them like cordwood there as an example for the villagers. Now, this is what happens to NVA/VC. So there must have been 15 bodies there.
Wow.
Once I started my civilian work again, which wasn't until a couple of months later, I took a couple of months off. Once I started my civilian job and went back to the company that I had worked for previously, that's when I noticed some things were different. So people knew that I was just come back from Vietnam. They knew I was in the Marines, and it wasn't they didn't want to have anything to do with you. They just treated you differently.
How so?
They didn't ask you at all about your experience. Some of them I had one or two I had known previous to me going into the service. So they knew me before then, and 4 years later, they didn't really have much to say.
Well,
So I was treated differently, given sort of a quasi quiet treatment, you might say.
So did you talk much about the war?
I started to some of my friends, and you start to talk about it, and you could tell that they didn't know what you were talking about. And I could kind of understand that unless you were describing to somebody that'd been there, they wouldn't have a clue what you were talking about. Nobody cared that I went to Vietnam, and they certainly didn't want to hear about it. So I didn't bring it up to anybody for a long, long time. I wouldn't want to go through the experience again necessarily, but I'm glad I had the experience. I think it changed me. My wife says it changed me a lot compared to the person I was before I went over there and the person that came back. That she says that I'm a lot different now.